A man weighing only around 38 kilograms, imprisoned in a Nazi German labor camp, and with almost no chance of survival. In that situation, most people would try to escape using familiar methods such as digging tunnels or breaking through fences. But he made a completely different decision: to steal an aircraft right in the middle of a German military base. That man was Mikhail Devyatayev. The aircraft he targeted was the Heinkel He 111, a twin-engine bomber with a wingspan of over 22 meters, designed for pilots who had to undergo months of training before being able to operate it independently. The problem was that the person sitting in the cockpit at that moment was not a pilot trained for this aircraft. He had never worked with German control systems, was unfamiliar with the cockpit layout, and had no time to learn. That meant the entire process from startup to takeoff had to be carried out almost entirely through observation and deduction. So, what led him to make that decision? A prisoner who did not speak German was facing a cockpit with more than 100 switches labeled entirely in German. A pilot, accustomed only to flying single-engine fighters, now had to operate a far more complex twin-engine bomber, and in a state of extreme exhaustion. Even gaining access to the aircraft inside a tightly controlled base was nearly impossible. The event took place at Peenemünde, the center of development for Germany's V-1 and V-2 strategic weapons programs during World War II, where security did not rely only on weapons, but on how people operated the system every day. And why was a plan that seemed almost impossible able to take place in such a tightly controlled environment? So how did he do it? Or was it all just luck? The answer is no. This was not random luck, but the result of multiple vulnerabilities existing simultaneously within the German control system at Peenemünde. The first failure appeared very early, at the level of identity management. Devyatayev was able to assume the identity of another prisoner who had died and exist within the system under a completely different name. This meant that an experienced fighter pilot was effectively downgraded into a regular laborer and assigned to work directly within an area tied to aviation operations. The second failure lay in how zones were structured and controlled. Prisoners were allowed to work near the runway, with direct access to aircraft and ground equipment. In a properly designed security system, this layer should have been strictly isolated. But at Peenemünde, the separation between prisoners and strategic assets was almost entirely removed. The third failure came from operational discipline itself. Guards and technical personnel left their positions at fixed times, particularly during lunch breaks. This created a recurring security gap every day, long enough for a small group to act without immediate detection. More importantly, the entire system was built on a flawed assumption that prisoners in a weakened state could not become a real threat. Once the adversary is underestimated, layers of control begin to loosen without anyone noticing. Under those conditions, Devyatayev's plan was no longer an isolated act of desperation, but a sequence of actions that could actually be executed. He did not create opportunity. He exploited gaps that already existed within the system. And when these vulnerabilities overlapped, wrong identity, flawed zoning, predictable timing, and misjudgment, the impossible began to become possible. The key point is that Devyatayev did not act randomly. What followed was the result of a process of observation and preparation within his own work environment. While working at the airfield, he was assigned to clear aircraft wreckage and maintain areas around the runway. This was one of the few positions that allowed a prisoner to access equipment directly without raising suspicion. It was here that Devyatayev began observing how German pilots operated their aircraft. He did not understand the language, but he could memorize the sequence of actions, how external power was connected, the order of switching controls, and how the engines were started. Instead of trying to understand the entire system, he focused on a single objective: replicating the exact sequence required to get the aircraft running. At the same time, target selection was critical. Not every aircraft could be used. His group chose a Heinkel He 111 assigned to the base command, a type that was always fueled and maintained in a ready state. This eliminated a major risk. There was no need to deal with refueling or technical checks before takeoff. And finally, timing. The group did not act at night or during chaos, but at a moment when the system was operating on routine, during lunch hours, when supervision dropped to its lowest level, but still appeared normal enough not to raise suspicion. When these three factors came together, on-site observation, correct target selection, and precise timing, the plan began to shift from an idea into a practical possibility. The key point is that Devyatayev did not act randomly. What followed was the result of a process of observation and preparation within his own work environment. While working at the airfield, he was assigned to clear aircraft wreckage and maintain areas around the runways. This was one of the few positions that allowed a prisoner to access equipment directly without raising suspicion. It was here that Devyatayev began observing how German pilots operated their aircraft. He did not understand the language, but he could memorize the sequence of actions, how external power was connected, the order of switching controls, and how the engines were started. Instead of trying to understand the entire system, he focused on a single objective, replicating the exact sequence required to get the aircraft running. At the same time, target selection was critical. Not every aircraft could be used. His group chose a Heinkel He 111 assigned to the base command, a type that was always fueled and maintained in a ready state. This eliminated a major risk. There was no need to deal with refueling or technical checks before takeoff. And finally, timing. The group did not act at night or during chaos, but at a moment when the system was operating on routine, during lunch hours, when supervision dropped to its lowest level but still appeared normal enough not to raise suspicion. When these three factors came together, on-site observation, correct target selection, and precise timing, the plan began to shift from an idea into a practical possibility. When all the elements were in place, the plan was executed within a very short window, exactly at the moment when the control system was at its weakest. Devyatayev's group did not approach the aircraft in a stealthy manner. Instead, they used normalcy itself to conceal their actions. A guard was quickly eliminated, and immediately after, another prisoner put on his uniform to lead the group toward the runway area, as if they were irregular work details. From a distance, there was no sign that anything unusual was happening. And that was the most effective form of camouflage. Once inside the aircraft, the biggest problem appeared immediately. Starting it, the Heinkel He 111 was not a system that could be operated by guessing step by steps. Starting it required the correct sequence. From connecting external power, activating systems, to igniting the engines, the first attempt failed. The engine did not respond properly, and time quickly became the most dangerous factor. Every passing second increased the chance of being detected, and under those conditions, there was no room for repeated trial and error. But Devyatayev did not stop. He adjusted his actions based on what he had observed earlier, and this time, the engines began to run. The aircraft started to move. However, another problem emerged during takeoff. With a body weight of only around 38 kilograms, he did not have enough strength to pull the control column to raise the nose at the right moment. In that situation, three others had to assist in pulling the control under his direction. This was no longer an individual action, but a coordinated effort required to overcome a physical limitation. When the aircraft left the ground, it was not just a takeoff. It was the moment when the entire plan shifted from possible to actually happening. But at that exact moment, the base began to realize what was going on. As soon as the aircraft left the ground, the situation immediately shifted into an entirely different phase, from infiltration to pursuit. At Peenemünde, an unscheduled takeoff of a Heinkel 111 was not something that could be ignored. The alert was triggered almost immediately, and ground forces were the first to respond. Anti-aircraft positions opened fire while the aircraft was still at low altitude. But with the target moving directly over the base's own runway, the chance of a successful shoot-down was very limited. Any deviation could cause damage to their own facility. As the aircraft began to leave the area, an interception order was issued. A Ju-88 fighter was deployed to pursue the target. At this point, Devyatayev was not only required to keep the aircraft airborne, he had to make decisions about direction with almost no information. He did not immediately fly straight out. Instead, the aircraft initially moved deeper into German territory, creating the impression that this was a legitimate internal flight. This was a deliberate act of deception. Once the distance was sufficient and the risk of identification decreased, the flight path was then adjusted toward the actual destination. However, the decisive factor came from the environment. Shortly after gaining altitude, the aircraft entered a dense cloud layer, enough to disrupt visibility and make tracking extremely difficult. The Ju-88 lost sight of the target under these conditions, at a time when German radar and air traffic control systems were not capable of precisely tracking a low-flying aircraft in complex weather. The opportunity to escape became much more apparent. This was not a simple escape maneuver, but the result of multiple factors: a logical choice of flight direction, proper timing, and favorable environmental conditions. Once the aircraft left the direct control zone of Peenemünde, it was no longer effectively pursued, and at that point, the escape was no longer a plan. It had become a reality. The escape did not end when Devyatayev left German-controlled airspace. What matters is that the Heinkel He 111 he took with him was not just a means of escape, but also a source of valuable intelligence. At Peenemünde, operations were not centered only around aircraft, but were directly tied to the V-1 and V-2 missile programs, strategic weapons that Germany was developing and deploying. During his time working there, Devyatayev not only observed how aircraft were operated, but also memorized the locations of launch sites, infrastructure, and the overall organization of the area. When he landed in Soviet-controlled territory, the greatest value he brought was not the aircraft itself, but the information he provided afterward: data on locations, structure, and operations at Peenemünde contributed to helping the Soviet Union accurately identify targets, enabling more effective strikes against Germany's missile systems. From this perspective, the escape was no longer just an act of personal survival. It became an event with a direct impact on the battlefield at a higher level. A prisoner escaped, but at the same time, he carried with him part of the intelligence of one of Germany's most important weapons programs. Looking back at the entire event, one thing becomes clear. This was not an escape based on luck. What happened was the result of multiple failures accumulating within the same system. From identity management, to area control, to repetitive daily operations, Devyatayev did not break that system by force, but by observing and exploiting the weaknesses that already existed within it. And when those failures overlapped, the impossible became possible. On a broader level, this is not just a story about an individual escaping from a prison camp. It reveals a very clear principle in modern warfare. A system does not need to be completely destroyed. It only needs to be exploited at the right weakness, at the right time, to lose control. And that is also why events like this do not belong only to history, but still hold analytical value to this day. If you've followed this far, you may already realize that this is not just an escape story, but a case of how a system that appears solid can be penetrated from within. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next analyses.